Lovely. Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be kicking us off today. Just a quick word about the EA. We are a learned society and a subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through secondary and further to higher education and beyond, and we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers, so thank you to all of you for giving your time so generously. And our members also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you'd like to contribute to national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. Right, I'm going to hand over now to Professor Alex Thompson, who's the Deputy Chair of the English Association, and he will be looking after our conversation this afternoon. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So yeah, brilliant. Welcome all of us to the next event in the Thinking Forward series. As Becky mentioned, my name is Alex Thompson. So I'm a Professor of Literature and Chair of the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures at Edinburgh University. And I'm here as Deputy Chair of the English Association. So I want to say a little bit about the series and then a little bit about today's session. And then I'm going to introduce our wonderful team who are going to present and then share some reflections with us today. So this is an event in the Thinking Forward series, which is a series which aims to provide a space for positive conversations about the changing shape of the discipline. So learning about some of the present successes of work that's happening across the country to imagine new futures, not just for English, but also for the humanities more broadly. So it's important to note that Thinking Forwards is a collaboration between the English Association and the IES. So that's the Institute for English Studies, which is part of the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. Now, we have a long-standing partnership with IES. We've done previous event series with them, and it's a great shame and that Professor Claire Lees, head of the IES, who is due to chair this event, is unable to be here today. Now, appropriately, the first programme of events running under the Thinking Forwards banner has really centred on collaboration and what it means to work together in different kinds of context. And today's event focuses on collaboration between STEM and SHAPE disciplines and will be led by us hearing about the Being Human project. So I'm going to begin by introducing the team members. And then Vivek and Jenny will in turn give you a little bit of presentation about the background to the project and what it involves. And then we have a series of prepared questions about the concept of collaboration, about what that's meant in the context of this project, which we hope through listening to the reflections of the team will bring lessons and inspiration for all of us. And then hopefully with time, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A from the audience today as well. So that's what we're going to do. And I'll begin with the introductions. So first of all, and they're all got their cameras on their screen, so they don't need to wave. I think you should be able to see their little names. So first up, Vivek Nityananda is a bioenvironmental scientist, and he's the David Phillips Research Fellow in the Centre for Behaviour and Evolution at Newcastle University. Tiago Sousa Garcia is a front-end web developer, and a digital humanist in the research software engineering team, also at Newcastle University. Jennifer Richards is the English 2001 chair at the University of Cambridge. She's also the chair of the English Association, so she's my boss. Olivia Smith is a literary scholar with experience of STEM-shaped collaborations, and she's a research associate on the project, also based at the University of Cambridge. Bennett Hogg is a composer, an improviser, and a cultural theorist who has interests in electroacoustic music, environmental arts, and free improvisation, also based at Newcastle University, where, last but by no means least, Magnus Williamson is Professor of Early Music. So again, Newcastle University. So that's this wide-ranging team. As you can see, they have skills and expertise from a great range of fields. And we're here today to think about what's made that such a magical combination when it's been brought together. So we're going to begin with a presentation by Jenny and Vivek. They're going to talk us through the background to the project. So I'll invite them to take us through that now.
Thank you very much, Alex. So I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes and Vivek will follow on presentation is about 10 minutes. I'm going to share my screen first. We've got some slides we'd like to share with you. So, can everybody see that? Oh, I'll have to go back to the beginning. Everybody can see those, yeah. Right, great. Okay. So the Being Human project is a collaboration between several disciplines: English literature, music and creative practice, bioenvironmental science and software engineering. And on the slide, you can see the landing page of the digital bee-book that we are creating together, all of us together, about which Tiago will speak at question time. On the screen now, you can see the full team in Vivek Nityananda's lab at Newcastle University, where he and his RA have been busy studying the possible emotion-like states of bees. Now, his work will sit alongside that of the humanities group in the digital book that we are creating, which will go live next year. None of the humanities team is a bee specialist. So there's a real question here about why is Vivek working with us? And what are we actually doing together? So as our title implies, this is a project about bees and their behaviour, but it is also much more than that. We are also exploring how to work together across distant disciplines when we put humans in relation to other beings, because all of us, everyone and every discipline has a stake in that topic and other topics where I think there should be more interdisciplinary research. Now, the catalyst for this project was not bees in Vivek's laboratory, about which we will hear more shortly in a few minutes, but the bees in a 17th century book for beekeepers by a clergyman called Charles Butler, who was trained in grammar, rhetoric and music, and he was also an amateur scientist, as well as a beekeeper. And that is important because he is the person who is credited with confirming the sex of the dominant bee in a honeybee beehive, that they are female, not male. And once he was confident of that fact, once he understood the sex of the dominant bee, he realized that the metaphors for bee behavior had to change, and so did the understanding of bee behavior and the social structure of the hive. And so he decided he was going to do some research on that, and he went out into the field, his fields, armed with a new kind of instrument, which was a wind instrument, a musical instrument. He decided to leave his book aside in the study of his classical histories of animals and to observe the bees and also to listen to them. And so what he did, he notated the tooting sounds in the hive just before swarming. And he produced a score of them, and then he interpreted what he heard. So his notation, which I will show you in a minute, is correct, but his interpretation is not. And that is because he imagined, that I'll show it to you now, here you can see. So this is the book that he produced, and here's the notation on the screen. But so the interpretation was not correct, and that is because he imagined the bees in the hive as a court of polite ladies, which clearly they are not. So that was wrong. But what he did do was create a new multidisciplinary 3D listening experience in print to help his readers get into the minds of bees, honeybees, at the point of swarming. So you can see if the on the left, you can see the title page of the book, and underneath it, the frontispiece. When you and that for us is a really important woodcut, because what Butler, his understanding of the book is that when you open the book, you enter a hive. So he understands his book as a hive, and when we go into it, as we read, we observe the bees. So there are lots of diagrams and pictures in the book, as well as descriptions. But you also learn by listening to them, and arguably by tooting like them. And you can see at the top 3 staves on the score to the right that those are the sounds of the bees tooting. And it is that idea of the book as a multidisciplinary and multi-sensory experience that we want to create in our digital bee book. Now, a point of interest for the humanities team is that Butler didn't just publish his book once, but 3 times. And each time he had it reprinted, it became a more fully sonic experience. So the final book, I think, which we've got a picture of that on the left, it's got phonetic spelling. Our team has transcribed and coded the first 2 editions, so they are fully machine readable. And Olivia, who's on this call, has collated them. And the 3rd phonetic version will be included via digital photos. So readers who enter our digital book will be able, and enter the humanities cell, will be able to track the changes that Butler made and study his evolving interest in sound as expressive of the emotions of bees and as a tool for understanding. They'll also be able to hear his notations fully animated, and they'll be able to listen to our discussion about how to perform them, as the is tooting best represented with a flute or with the human voice? That's a performance choice. And if it is the latter, what does it mean to toot like a queen? What is the experience of Butler and understanding that Butler wanted to the reader to have? Now, we are closely working with our music colleagues, Magnus Williamson and Bennett Cobb, who are also on this call. Now, what I've been describing is the humanities work package of the project. Alongside this and separate to it has been the science work in the laboratory. That's the work package led by Vivek. So actually, the discipline that we work in separate teams in a parallel way. But even though we work separately, we are collaborating. It is for us an interdisciplinary project. We go to Vivek's lab to watch the experiments. We meet monthly or every other month, online or in person. We read and discuss relevant work from the humanities and the sciences. And we are currently, as a team, full team, everybody is involved in a disciplinary chapter with its bee song at the heart of his book. We're doing that together.
Jenny, sorry to interrupt you. Your notes are covering up your camera.
Okay, sorry. And we also, I'm so sorry. We also respectfully watch each other. So Olivia will say more about this in a moment. But what we have been learning, she'll say more about what we have been learning from each other. But for now, I will hand over to Vivek.
Thank you, Jenny, and thanks everyone for having me here. Hope you can hear me. So the science work, the biology work, I guess the starting point was this idea of, the link to Butler's work is this idea of the bees interacting with each other and piping and tooting and influencing each other. And there has been work more recently on this idea that perhaps bees could have emotions. And so I was trying to, we're kind of, I guess we were trying to bring together that idea and the work that Butler, the suggestions that Butler had made. But I guess the big question for us in the sciences was, how can we even begin to search for bee emotions? So the work package is trying to think of ways in which we can conceptualize this. One of the approaches, if we go to the next slide, Jenny, one of the approaches that people have been using, actually not so much in bees, but across more vertebrate species, comes from animal welfare, where they have been testing things like optimism and pessimism in animals. And this basically boils down to what we've called expectations of reward. And we've been looking at that in the lab with my PhD student, Olga Prochenko. The basic idea is this, if we go to the next slide. You could test or train an animal to recognize that one stimulus gives it a high reward, say something that's blue, and one that has a low reward, say something that's green. But the test which you do for, say, pessimism or optimism is how, after it has learned these associations, does it respond to an ambiguous stimulus. So you can think of this relating to our notion, our own pessimism and optimism. Our interpretations of events, stimuli, are skewed based on the state we're in. If we're more pessimistic, we would then respond negatively to ambiguous stimuli. So the idea was we train the bees on 2 different stimuli and then test them on an ambiguous stimulus. If you go to the next slide, sorry. in the lab, what we did was we trained the bee, we showed the bee green, say, on a computer screen, and that indicated a low reward on the right-hand side. So that's what you can see over there. Or it could, in a separate trial, the bee would be presented blue, and that would indicate a high reward on the left-hand side. So you can, I hope you can see those numbers on the screen as well. So basically one color indicated one level of reward on one side, and the other color indicated a higher level of reward on another side. And we changed this across bees, which color was which. So the bee now knew, once it was trained, it would go left for one color, get a low reward, get a high reward, or right for another color and get a low reward. And then we would test it with these ambiguous colors. Well, so what the two colors it's learned, indicating high and low rewards, and then 3 ambiguous colors in between. But crucially, to induce stress or pessimism, we also had simulated predatory attacks on the bees. So if you, I think just click, Jenny, that should do it. Yeah. And we did this by either shaking the bee as, you know, a badger shaking the hive would be, and that's been used before, or trapping the bee like a spider for a brief while with a sponge. So we hold down the bee, and that was, the idea was that might induce some kind of pessimistic state. And we also had bees, I mean, this is the word which we use in science, I guess, very often, it's control bees. So bees that were not manipulated or, you know, just allowed. And then we tested these bees. And I think that's the next slide again, Jenny. Yeah, so apologies for graphs, I guess, but this is the language in which we talk in as scientists. So on the x-axis here, you have the different colors we used, and I haven't used just blue or green because that changed across experiments. But we had a color indicating a high reward, a color indicating a low reward, and these 3 ambiguous colors in the middle. But what's on the y-axis is how often the bee went towards the high reward side. So that's an indication of what it expected. Did it expect to get a high reward, or did it expect to get a low reward based on what color it saw? So we just focus on the kind of the extremes of the graph. When we showed it a high reward color, the bees always went to the high reward side. When we showed it a low reward color, the bees always went to the low reward side. But when we showed it these ambiguous colors, the difference was between the bees that had experienced the stress and the bees that hadn't. So the bees that hadn't are in blue here, and they perhaps have a slight tendency in the middle to go towards the high reward side, but it's neutral. But that definitely decreases if you've stressed them out. So that only decreases for the ambiguous colors. It does not decrease for either the high or low reward color. So it changes we're arguing the perception of ambiguity. So essentially what we're saying is stress bees seem to be more pessimistic and making these choices. But what we did further, and this was with the RA on the project, and the next slide, Jenny. So the RA on the project was Balamurli GS, Balu, as we call him. And what we were really interested with this project is to make that connection of, can they actually transmit these states to one another? So if you meet someone who's stressed, you might come off from that interaction quite stressed yourself. So that was the logic behind this. And also, you know, it links again to the bees interacting with each other in the hive, as Butler was looking at. And how we designed this experiment is that we, I'm trying to see if I, well, what we did was we allowed a stressed bee to interact with the non-stressed bee and then tested that non-stressed bee. So if you go to the next slide, I think I can quickly show you that. So again, the green one is the bees that have not experienced any negative conditions. Then if you look at the red one, that's the one that has been stressed by shaking. So that's exactly as we saw before. For the ambiguous colors in the between here, the bees tend to go to the low reward side. But the interesting thing is that when we allowed stressed bees to interact with non-stressed bees and then tested the non-stressed bees, they behave very similarly to the control bees, the bees that had not experienced stress. So at least in this experiment, we do not show that these states can go from one bee to another as, say, with humans, if that's one definition of emotional states. If you go to the next slide, though, there's another curious, oh yeah, sorry. So interacting with the stress bee does not induce pessimism. But we were also curious because you need to adapt some of these experiments to the animal you're working with, and you can't expect it all to be the same. And perhaps with bees, chemical cues are more important. And so we did an experiment where we know that bees release an alarm pheromone when you pinch them. So if you pinch them and allow another bee to experience the alarm pheromone but not interact with the main bee, how does that change things? And if you click again, Jenny, yeah, what we showed was that for that medium ambiguous condition, compared to bees that hadn't been stressed, just experiencing an alarm pheromone makes a bee more pessimistic. So again, this isn't evidence that the states transmit, but it does show that, you know, you can communicate, if you like, a state to and induce a state, not through anything physical activity, but just through chemical experience. So if you go to the final slide, I think just the summary of the points. Yeah, so we find that like our attempts of trying to characterize what these states are, that it seems to change their expectations of rewards, but not transmit between bees. Another thing I haven't talked about, it seems to change their initial preference for colors. So yeah, they have innate preferences. Bees usually like colors that are in the blue UV range. And when they get stressed, they seem to fall back on those. And also, again, something I haven't talked about, that if you have the pinching versus the shaking, you can get different effects. So it's not like all stressful events lead to the same thing. So that's the state of where we're at right now. And I guess we go on to the next questions, but of course we can talk more about this later. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny and Vivek. That's just fascinating and wonderful to hear. There's two very rich and complementary disciplinary experiences sort of held together in the space of the project. And what I think people probably have many questions about the different sides of the project, but of course what we're really here to think about today is what it's like for you guys to work together and what you've been what's been communicated and transmitted between all of your team as you circle around these fascinating questions. So I'm going to ask a series of questions which for the audience, our speakers and their colleagues have had a chance to think about their responses to, which will hopefully draw out some of the aspects of the collaboration which have made it so rewarding and so refreshing, but also maybe thinking about what it means and how we can, you know, how do we make work like this happen. So the first question is really goes back to the beginning, I guess, which is how did your collaboration come about? And there's a sort of follow-up part of this, which is, and how does it get held together? And Tiago, I think, are you going to kind of give us your side of the story here?
Yes, thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to it's always a pleasure to talk about this project and our work. So how did it start? I actually remember clearly. It started one day. Jenny went to London, came back to us and said, "I've seen this amazing book." It was at the Wellcome Library that she found a copy of the 1634 Feminine Monarchy by Charles Butler. And she started talking to us about the book, and we realized it was the perfect focal point for an interdisciplinary project. So as Jenny mentioned at the start, it was a book about the natural world, written by a rhetorician and musician, amongst many other things, that offered a new political allegory, feminine monarchy, at the time in which Elizabeth is about to die, or just died. Elizabeth I, of course. Confirms new knowledge that the sex of the monarch of bees is feminine. That includes transcriptions of animal sounds, as well as a song inspired by animal sounds. It was published multiple times with significant differences, including an entire new proposed spelling. So there's a lot of things, a lot of disciplinary aspects to this book. So we immediately thought this is the point to create a great interdisciplinary project. And because at the time, Jenny and Magnus and I and other people around the university were working on a project called ATNU, which was all about thinking about digital interventions and digital explorations of text. We thought that one way which we could do that, which we could do some kind of thing with this book, was in the digital sphere. But we also very quickly realized we couldn't just do it ourselves. We needed to bring more people in, and that's when Vivek and other people came in, because you can't really talk about bees in the natural world without having someone who knows anything about bees in the natural world with us. That was kind of the thinking. So this is how things came about. So we started talking, had lots of discussions, big, very interesting meetings and workshops trying to figure out what we were going to do. I guess this goes into the second part of your question, Alex, which is how do we hold this project together? And I think the short answer is with great difficulty. So thinking about how we all put our work together in the same place has been with us from the start. I think from the very first meeting that we had, that Jenny gathered a few people in probably a Zoom meeting room, because I think it happened during the pandemic or just about. And how we were going to all work together has been the question that we've been asking ourselves from that very first meeting. I think we started with the same idea that most interdisciplinary projects start with, which is trying to find a way in which we could all work in the same problem together, right? And so the question is, could all these disciplines, we have literary studies, early modern music, composition, biology, could all these disciplines work together to solve the same problem? And I think we quickly realized that some pairings and some groupings of disciplines work better at doing that kind of thing than others. So, for example, for the literary side and the early modernists in both literary and musical side, it's more natural, more easy to work in the same problem than it is to work with Vivek and his team. Same thing for Bennett, who may come along with a very different interpretation of what he thinks the exploration of the music side of the piece should be. And then it's me, who I'm technically the technology expert here, to say, no, we cannot do that on the web because that's not going to work. People can't do it. So we very quickly found that ideal of interdisciplinarity in which people from all around the table come together and solve the same problem, and the world is a much better place. That ideal is not very useful in practice, and is not the one key that will solve all of humanity's problems, right? And I think we figured out we couldn't solve the problem of this book by using that approach to interdisciplinary. So I think what we started to discover as we were talking is that instead of finding this common problem that we can all serve, it would be better served if we took the book itself as a source of inspiration. So if you think back to the original book, The Feminine Monarchy, it contains something from each of our disciplines, but even it itself is impossible to be contained by a single book, right? That's why we have three very different editions, right? And each of those three says something different about a different discipline as well. But we now have the technology in which we can contain all of our knowledge together, and we can explore all of our knowledge together. And I think that's where we came to this idea of the digital ebook that Jenny showed the landing page at the start. I think a big part of the appeal of doing this way was the potentially egalitarian way in which we could present our respective research, and the way in which we could recognize that we could do the presenting of the results in a different way depending on who the reader was. So broadly speaking, was the reader a specialist, someone who understands the raw data sets that, for example, Vivek was talking about, or someone who needs kind of a TED talk about it and a very simple explanation of what's going on, right? Is it a member of the public or is it a specialist? So we could present our results in different ways depending on who's seeing it. We could organize the book differently depending on the reader. Should we start with science, or should we start with the music, or should we start with the literary aspects of it, or the historical, or the political allegory? And from this kind of myriad of possibilities, we've realized that we could use both Butler and the bees themselves and the hive as a kind of an inspiration to how we design this digital bee-book, this digital product. And that's how we arrived at the current bee-book, which, if you think back to Jenny's first slide, it tries to be reminiscent of a hive. You have all those hexagons with all cells, and depending on your chosen cell of entry, you will have a different view of the book. So if you go through the cell that says science, you'll be presented with Vivek's data, you'll be presented with his explanation, their explanation, so Vivek and his team explanation of what's going on. But importantly, you'll also be presented with kind of our own version of the traditional hyperlink, in which at a certain point when Vivek mentions something that might be relevant from the literary side, you have a little portal that takes you directly to the literary side, and suddenly you're in a completely different discipline, seeing the same book from a different perspective. So we call these things portals, by the way, which is not very imaginative, but I think it gives you an idea of what they are. So I think as we were jostling over what
Tiago, you might want to move on a bit because we need to leave time for questions.
Very quickly, I'm coming to the last point. So as we were discussing what interdisciplinary meant to us, we've realized that working interdisciplinarily was itself an interesting aspect of our project, and it's something that we decided to record, and it's something that we decided to think about, and that's why we have another little cell that says connection. So this is the point in which we reflect on the way in which we've been working together, which I'm sure Olivia will cover in great detail. So that's about it. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. And yeah, it's wonderful to hear how, if you like, the question about how you're working together is now part of the project. So Olivia, I wonder, do you think you could tell us a little bit about how that collaboration works? I think Tiago's described this sort of unbundling of projects, but there's obviously, Jenny mentioned, there's ways to tie them together, and I'm imagining that there are challenges as well as pleasures in that process.
Yes, thanks, Alex. I found it really fun to make some notes on this. My role is to be quite close to Butler's text, so I suppose how I talk will come from there. Butler himself had a sense that all the disciplines could be kind of joined and mutually beneficial. And he thought you could be a sort of natural historian and scientist of bees, and a composer of their music, and then an essayist, and he was all of these things. And we haven't tried to pressurize one individual to embody all of those things in this project. But what we have tried to do is to foster a dialogue between those parts of his kind of identity. So we have kind of, what we've done is to sort of lean in to that Renaissance belief that these types of knowledge are all joined, and that they have a kind of natural cohabitation, that these types of knowing naturally cohabitate somehow. So we've listened to each other across the different domains and kind of held that communication like a sort of guy rope, sometimes like this, feeling the tension in it and kind of working out how to temper our communication to keep it there and to not drop it or to sort of pull someone over. And that's been very interesting. So we've got various practical modes of collaboration. The most simple one being that we share the scholarly page. We share the page. We've written a group diary, which we've done after every meeting. Originally, it was intended to kind of embody a sort of almost like a naturalist's diary. What did you see? Write down what you saw. And we put them together in one document. So you can see who wrote each bit, but they live together there. And we're annotating a chapter together, which is chapter 5 of the Bee Book, which is really the centerpiece that contains that sort of amazing music that Jenny was showing, and lots of stuff, the main stuff about bees and emotions. And we're adding expertise from all our home disciplines to create a sort of polyphonic annotator, which I think is going to be really exciting. We have tried to learn each other's languages, our disciplinary languages. Obviously, everyone's discipline has a different way of talking about the world. And I would say that we've done a lot of listening on that and reading, and we're all now at least kind of beginner/intermediate, could go on holiday for the weekend to each other's discipline, which is really exciting. And I think the first time that Vivek, showed us graphs, we were like, but now, it seems really familiar to me now. And I think that's really good. We've had a practical immersion in each other's expertise by going into the scientist's lab and seeing those bees being sort of pinched and getting distressed, or by drawing them into the text and the sort of literary editing and looking really into the digital side of things, what's Tiago doing, or sort of deep dive into the musical bee score. We listen to each other talk in and out of our specialisms and learn how it sounds when each other are speaking from a place of really established knowledge, or when our colleagues are speaking more speculatively across that divide. And I think within that, we've noticed 2 different types of kind of collaborative conversation, both of which I find really interesting. So if someone is talking from sort of deeply in their expertise, which is a great delight for the speaker and the listeners, it seemed to me to become more likely that the other team members were either sort of learning, or they would match a piece of their own expertise to what was being said. And so one instance of this was you get effects like the amazing scientific theory on emotion-like states, which is very careful and very current in science, got matched by affect theory in the humanities, which we know a lot about. We brought that out to match it, and that's been very useful to us. Or you get dialogue in that more speculative place where everyone has inched out of their comfort zone and we're standing on a different kind of mutual ground. And this happened when we were discussing a passage in Butler's book where he relates a kind of secondhand anecdote about some bees building a tiny chapel. Now, could that happen? We asked the scientists, Was it possible for the bees to do that? What kind of storytelling or feelings propel the anecdote into the text? How did it make us feel? Did we believe it? Did we like it? It was really exciting to hear everyone puzzling over this, as original readers might have done. And I don't think we yet have the answer to that one. So just the last thing I had, because it's sporting to have a difficulty in these things. So I would say that we've learned that we have very different disciplinary approaches to sort of articulating and holding uncertainty. And uncertainty is that great place where all research questions come out, where the kind of meat of creating new knowledge lives. And I felt like literary scholars often recognise uncertain moments in a text as kind of sort of generative moments, moments of playfulness or deep thinking, sort of affordances for kind of tipping points and seeing lots of other sides of something. Whereas scientists, sorry, Vivek, this is going to sound a little bit rude. Whereas scientists can sometimes seem to kind of suck language in around uncertainty to minimise it and sort of surround it. So I've noticed that's a different moment, and we often get a point of really interesting friction around that. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Olivia. I mean, I have to share the kind of views of colleagues in the chat, which is that this is just absolutely fascinating to listen to. But I think my third question will kind of maybe gets to the meat of the sort of what is the point of all this, because it's fascinating and it's a wonderful journey, and I can see how much you're learning from each other and from the process. But the third question is, what are you able to do now as a result of your collaboration? What are you learning? I guess, what are you going to take away? Will you go back to being new and improved researchers in your home disciplines? Will you be doing more interdisciplinary work? So I think several people had suggestions for answers to this, and I think we haven't heard from Magnus and Bennett. I don't know if you wanted to come in first on this.
Thank you. I'll answer that question slightly obliquely, just to say that one of the interesting things about having musical notation in a book of this kind is that it, at first sight, doesn't seem to belong there. You've got a text on beekeeping written by a rhetorician who also has an interest in music theory, and in musicology, the presence of the bee song seems to be treated as something that's a bit of an oddity, not quite easy to explain away. And yet, one of the great benefits of working in an interdisciplinary team, all of us converging on the same artifact, but from very different standing points, is that it makes you interrogate the material in different ways. So it re-triangulates your own ideological position relative to the material. And I had a kind of epiphanic moment when I was looking at the 1623 edition of Feminine Monarchy, where Charles Butler greatly expands the text, introduces this 4-part polyphonic song, and also introduces a large number of 2-dimensional illustrative graphs to show the structure of the hive and the passing of the seasons and so on. And I realized he's using music as a form of graph. And musical notation is actually a graphical form, in the sense that it shows the rising and falling of melodies by its vertical position on the page. And he uses that graph as a form of representing the passage of time in the process when the bees are about to swarm. So even though the song was subsequently dropped from the posthumous editions of Feminine Monarchy, for Charles Butler, the bringing together all of these different elements wasn't just a sort of personal gratification of his own particular interests. I think he did intend them really to serve very specific purposes in the way that the book was experienced by its readers. And taking forward from this particular project, it makes one, it quickens one's interest in cases where musical notation is found in unusual places. You know, what are the neighbours of the artifacts that you're really interested in?
Fascinating. Does anyone else want to come in on this one?
I think it would be great to hear from Vivek. Yeah.
I could, if that's all right. Yeah, I think one of the things in terms of the question of what you couldn't do without this interaction, if I'm honest, I guess we were, at least the science was fairly modular, so we were doing things that we have done in the past. But I think the more important thing for me has been this repeated, almost like turning up and interacting and talking. And there's almost like a slow burn effect, which I find slowly gets you thinking in another way or self-reflecting. And I think that's the thing that I've most gained. And in some ways, the most specific things which I can talk about, I think one of the things is what Olivia touched on and how science has to, you know, crystallize a definition and pinpoint it down before you can start doing anything. And that's, for me, that's just the nature of science. But again, maybe we can question even that. But I think what would be really good is what goes into that definition. And that's where the input can come from everyone else, from all the humanities and everyone, like especially when you're talking about emotions. So you can relate it back to past definitions, past history of emotions, of beekeeping, and try to do that. The other thing is, it's also interesting with this particular book, how Charles Butler calls things that he, specific activities he's done, he calls them experiments. And, you know, whether we would consider them, scientists would consider them experiments or not, you know, we might not. But nonetheless, he does find true things in terms of the bees being a feminine monarchy as opposed to masculine monarchy. So then how much, like, what is the contribution to truth of an experiment? But also, if you go back to previous experiments, even within biology and evolutionary biology especially, how much they have been influenced by the norms of their times, and whether we would consider those valid experiments any longer, or even those results valid. And so there's a whole self-reflection aspect of that, which I think is really interesting. There's also a lot of reflections, I guess, on how, like, the interdisciplinary projects can be planned, I think. And I do like our approach in terms of, you know, letting this interaction lead us to where we get to. But I think there's also space for having either built in within a project or before you apply for funding, say, a long period where you build in that aspect and make that plan of how each discipline will contribute to each other much more explicit. I don't know, I like these interactions, but that's also, I think, something that can be really helpful to pinpoint it before you go in.
If I might add something following on the back of what Vivek just said, and I've been talking a lot about this with Tiago, our model for interdisciplinarity, well, we know the future is interdisciplinary, but nobody quite knows how to do it. But the models we have privilege certain kinds of work and create hierarchies between disciplines as well. So they're very fixed on solving a bit of problem. That's what Tiago was talking about. But actually, we know from the United Nations, it's clear that the Sustainable Development Goals are not being sorted out, and there's a recognition that actually the solutions, which are very expected to come from STEM alone, that's not going to work. But finding a way to bring in, create space for the perspectives of art and humanities and social science is not something we've really started to think about. But I really like Vivek's idea that actually having a long lead-in time to a project, perhaps with different multidisciplinary voices, because as I said at the beginning, everybody has a stake in the approach to and the answers to these questions.
One of the things that I found really interesting about it, and in a sense that question, you know, what can I do because of this? For me, what's emerged as really interesting, at the risk of sounding slightly contrarian, what was I able to do before this interaction? Because I'm interested in sound, I'm interested in music, I'm interested in environmental sound, I'm interested in how different species communicate. And as part of this project, one of the things I've discovered is that bees are probably deaf. And so everything I was thinking about what I might do with the sound of bees and how significant the sound of bees is, it's a bit like sort of opening the door to the lift and going, oh dear, the lift's not there. So it's made me have to sit back and sort of rethink my disciplinary area. There's two sides to that. One, the sound that bees make is sound to us. And so it's as Martin Benchik, one of the bee scientists I've been talking about recently, says, if bees would rather not make a sound if possible because they're edible and they're small. So it's not a terribly good adaptation to survival to be quite such a noisy creature. And that's quite interesting to think about when I'm thinking about, well, actually, what fascinates me about bees is the piping of the queens and the sound and that they make. So I've discovered things on this that's maybe actually have to really rethink the nature of sound. Where the sound is, actually the sound's in us. It's probably not in the bees. The bees are sensing vibrations, but they're sensing very low frequency vibrations, actually below the threshold that we would hear them as pitch. Apparently the noise that the queen makes, the vibration the queen makes is between 4 and 6 hertz. We don't hear that as a musical sound. We hear that as but that's a significant frequency for the bees in their immediate vicinity. So as I say, all the things that I thought I knew about bees but were afraid to ask, when I asked, I found out that the answer made my life a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult than it was at the beginning. But I'm a great fan of the New Zealand philosopher Carl Mika. I don't know if any of you've come across Carl Mika's work. He's an expert in Heidegger, in fact, but he's also of Maori heritage, and he's done quite a lot of critical work on, where are the problems with the Western episteme. And one of the things that we like to be we like in Western philosophy is a degree of certainty. And I think other people have mentioned already the sort of the uncertainties that arise through interdisciplinary work, and the way that our disciplinary ground inevitably has to shift. And he advocates cultivating actually a certain humility towards uncertainty, and that actually uncertainty is a really good place to be if you want to stop just repeating the tropes, the positions of the past. So yeah, so that's kind of, as I say, it might sound like almost like a via negativa, but it's not. It's actually a really good way of learning. When effectively my whole discipline is like kind of thrown out the window because it doesn't mean anything in bee world. So, yeah, it's been interesting.
Thank you so much, everybody. That's so fascinating. We do have a few minutes, and I wonder if anyone in our audience would like to ask a question, because there's so much rich material for reflection there. If anyone wants to put their hand up. Yeah, Lorna, thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. This is really just fascinating. It's and what a lovely thing for a Friday as well. It's a really happy thing to be thinking about with all the news that's less happy. So I put my question in the chat, but just to verbalize it, I just wondered whether you have any plans to take this into schools so that younger people can be inspired by what you're doing, and if so, what those plans might be. I think those of us on the art side are sort of still reeling from Sunak's big promoting of the STEM earlier on in the year. No offense to scientists and mathematicians, but I think young people could really benefit from knowing how the disciplines can work together so fruitfully and so imaginatively and creatively. And yes, graphs are valuable for English and for music and everything else. I mean, everything that you've said, I think would resonate really nicely in schools. So yeah, so my question is, will you be taking it into schools, and how, and in what guise?
We haven't factored that into the immediate plans, but but through the thinking forwards, we will be taking some of the thinking into schools. I should say that this is a 3-year project, so it's been full on, just trying to do the transcriptions and get the science done. But I think that's a really excellent idea, Lorna. So just very quickly, 2 things. First of all, we are trying to do it across the thinking forward, what you're proposing. Part of that is work part of that is work that's happening that Becky is leading on between maths and English, the Maths Association and the English Association. So just trying to create that join up in earlier years education. But I should say that Vivek often goes into schools and actually alongside with the theatre company Kappa Pi in Newcastle. And I think that we will want to take the whole of the Being Human project work into schools with Vivek and Kappa Pi at some point. But Vivek, maybe you would like to say something about the work you do with in schools with a theatre company.
Yeah, just really quickly, what we've been doing is taking this, well, actually just talking about insects more than anything else, and their importance and the fact that they're disappearing. We've been running workshops with the theatre company in schools, and we've used input from what the children find interesting, but also things they say and to form lyrics to songs about insects. We've been designing a kind of a musical show based on insects. So that was something that I planned with this theatre company, and it's called The Vanishing Act. But it has been, again, a two-way process, because you get to know what people find important, what really excites the children, and you know what. And I think that gives you feedback for your own research, or you know what maybe your focus could be on. I think so. It's not just giving them information.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. Just to say, I'm organising, she says, slight plug now then, I'm organising an in-person event for BERA, the British Educational Research Association, next summer in Bristol on English, subject English and sustainability. So if anybody would like to come along to Bristol next year, I mean, I can pop you over some details of that and chance to submit a paper. Thank you so much. That's brilliant.
I think I would definitely love to come along to that, Lorna. The other thing I would mention is that your question was also about the collaboration and creating more collaboration across disciplines within schools. And I think that the Challenge Lab idea we heard about last time would be perfect for that, where you actually you hand it over, not the experts, but to the young people to do the exploring themselves.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jenny. Catherine.
Thanks, everybody. That's been really fascinating. I have lots of questions, but I'll try and kind of keep it simple. So two briefly. One, have you been working with beekeepers themselves in this project in any way? And what are the implications, I guess, in the real world of beekeeping? And also, you talked about the ways in which the science and so on has been looking at the our effects on bees and our effects on their, or the sort of the test have been around their emotions. Is there anything that demonstrates the effect that bees have on our emotions through our interacting of them, other than kind of freaking Bennett out by discovering that they're deaf, but just sort of thinking about it the other way around, and our emotional sort of affective engagement with bees?
Well, I suppose that Butler's book is all about his effective relationship with bees. Once he found out that they were, the dominant bee was female, and his book is as much about his relationship with bees as it is about the relationship between the bees. I'll be curious to see what Vivek has to say about that. But in terms of the question about working with beekeepers, Bennett certainly has connections with beekeepers, but Olivia is going to give a talk to the Northumbrian Natural History Society and to beekeepers as part of that. Olivia, do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, at some point in the new year, me and perhaps Bennett as well, and we're going to extend links with the Northumbrian Natural History Society and go in there and give a talk and bring out things from the archive, talk about, they've got a project going on at the moment called Nature's Cure, which is a bit about emotions and nature, and we're going to link up with them. And I hope that the millions of beekeepers will come along to that, and we can kind of integrate our project with them. So I'm really looking forward to that.
There is, just in terms of, it's a piece of creative work, but in terms of human emotions and beekeeping, I don't know, some people on here will probably know Sean Borrowdale's collection just called Bee Journal, the poet, Sean Borrowdale's Bee Journal. I very strongly recommend it as it's basically he and his partner get a beehive and it's a year and what happens. And it's parts of it I just found incredibly moving and powerful, partly because of the sort of the connection they develop to the bees, but also the awareness that the bees are just so radically different. It's a really powerful collection of poems. Sean Borrodale, Borrodale, just as a wonderful document of human emotions in connection to domestic bees. I think it's a wonderful piece of work.
Brilliant. Well, yeah,
Vivek just wanted to say something. So
of course.
Just really quickly, that I do know some work that has looked at how people perceive animals in general, maybe not so much insects. But I know that a kind of a collaborator of ours who's on our trustee board actually has done some work in India, looking just canvassing what people think of various insects. And I think she found one interesting thing she found is that farmers do sometimes classify bees as harmful insects, which is a bit worrying. But yeah, I know there's some work on this.
Brilliant. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We're just coming up to the end of our scheduled time together, but it's been a real delight to listen to, and anything where I come away with a mind enriched with both scientific questions and a recommendation for poetry to go and read is clearly a good lunchtime. So I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking virtually our kind of contributors today. So that's Jenny Richards and her team, Vivek, Diego, Olivia, Bennett, and Magnus. And thanks to Becky and to the Institute for English Studies for organising this fantastic series on working together and thinking forwards.